So this talk will be the first of about 13 talks, maybe 14. And it will be called The Cosmology of the Soul. And it will be the introduction to the whole series called Liberation Psychology. And the subtitle of it all is A Primer in Unitive Thought. So, to begin the cosmology of the soul, we won't reconcile science and spirituality, no matter how we try, if we continue creating forced and often false equivalencies between various understandings culturally of what science and spirituality are. To accomplish this reconciliation that Einstein, along with all the major avatars, have called for in the last 100 years, at least, maybe 200 years, depends on how you look at it. But to accomplish it, we must come to a realized state, not a cognitive construct, but a realized state of truth. And quantum physicist John Hagelin has actually put it this way: Atman equals Brahman. So anyone who has any sense of Hinduism at all understands that traditionally in Hinduism, the goal is making Atman and Brahman one. Atman is the closest thing that we could arrive at to change it into English would be soul. Brahman would be the Holy Spirit or God the Father, the Creator and the presence of God. As it gets down into Christianity, it would be, could be the Logos, the beginning of the Gospel of John, an arcane einho logos, which means in the beginning was the Word, was the Logos. Now the soul of every living thing in the realized state, not in the cognitive state, in the realized state, the soul of every living thing is the soul of the cosmos in that form. So you sitting here before me and me sitting here before you are two local aspects or centers of the cosmos in these two forms. And everything else that lives, and in another way, everything else that is living or not living, is a manifestation of that one universal soul. Now, in these talks, I'm not going to condescend to the listener or viewer. I'm simply going to say it as it is, and it's the job of anyone interested in this to research and pursue it further. There is no way for anyone to create realization in someone else. We can spark it, and then they have to go through the work of realization of the truth for them in their part of the cosmos. So in a very real sense, the cosmos is absolutely present in each and every one of us. So the soul of every living thing is the soul of the cosmos. So the greatest realization is really announced in every tradition, and in the Christian presentation, it's I and the Father are one. And then later, St. Paul says, I no longer live, but Christ lives in me. And there's a version of that in every single tradition, all of them. And the listener and reader is simply going to have to trust that I've looked, and looked long and hard. Space is not something, nor is it nothing. We need a third category, which I hold to be consciousness. Consciousness is the mind of divinity, by whatever name we choose to call it, present as universe. Space is not something, nor is it nothing. I'm going to return to that later on. The third category would be a universal consciousness that is, number one, infinite. Its extent is without boundary and eternal. It is not in any way dependent on time. In fact, it produces Einsteinian time. And that'll be another conversation. So, what then is this category of consciousness in the traditions? Tao, Logos, Brahman. These are the Indian, Chinese, and Middle Eastern terms for understanding what this is that we're talking about. Consciousness is the source of both energy and matter. It precedes them because it's their source. So the fundamental truth of the universe is the mind of God. That's the fundamental truth. And ultimately, if there is to be a grand unified theory, it is the only one that's possible. And the scientists know that. But because science has its own disciplines, it can't really comment on that which precedes the fireball or the Big Bang. So, the first manifestation of this field of consciousness, which is infinite, eternal, and present everywhere, and we are right now manifesting it by recognizing its presence and talking about it. In other words, I'm sitting here with you so that a third may be present. There's me, there's you, and there's a third. And in Hinduism, again, they talk about the perceiver, that which is perceived, and the act of perception as one. That's their trinity in a sense. It's one of their trinities. They have other names for it, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, and so on. But one of their trinities is that triunal idea of oneness. It's not just Judeo-Christian. It's present everywhere. It's also present in Taoism. But that's another conversation. So, the first manifestation or intention of consciousness itself seems to be the quantum field, the emergence of that which is subatomic, but present as energy and matter in this field of probability. In the physics of David Bohm, it would be called the implicit order, which then manifests itself or explicates itself as you and me. We're floating in an ocean of consciousness, and it presents to you and me, it presents you and me. We are it present now, and you can feel it. As soon as you start talking about it, it almost says, yeah, that's true. You feel it. So it goes like this. The quantum field is the first intention of this universal mind. Next comes what I call the Cosmo Logos. it dawned on me recently, we're familiar with the word cosmology, geology, biology. Well, what they are is the study of the Cosmo Logos, the Cosmo Tao, the Cosmo Brahman. It's the study of. But we can use the words that I've never seen anywhere. Cosmo Logos, Geologos, Biologos, Anthropologos, and Anthropologos, the anthropological presentation of this universal, of the study, the presentation of this mind to be studied as anthropology, in fact, is what Teilhard de Chardin has called the noosphere, the sphere of knowing. And that is a gathering up of all the cultures into one level of evolution, one level of it, called the noosphere, the sphere of knowing. And Thomas Berry calls it, many others do too, call it self-reflection. The universe becomes aware of itself because we're aware of it. So it arises in us. Again, the Hindus would say that all of it is an illusion that we create. Well, that's not quite acceptable to me. But what it is, it does not emerge into our understanding of it in any other way than through us, because we're a different kind of consciousness. Einstein has shown us that mass bends light, and that light itself has mass. So he does this play on words. Light is heavy. In other words, it contains mass. But we think of things as, we use the word light both for the presence and emanation of light, but also for this is light, doesn't weigh much, doesn't have much mass. So he says that energy is in fact heavy. It has mass. This was revelatory for me the first time I started thinking about it. So there has been experimentation also with weighing the soul. And it was part of my doctoral research, and I forget where I got this, but I know I read of this man who weighed a body right at the moment of death, and then weighed the same body just after death. And there was a slight but measurable difference in weight. So the light within the man has mass. We don't think of light that way. We don't think of it that way, do we? We think of light as being the opposite of mass. It was Einstein's realization that I'll continue to unfold here as best I can. I'm not a physicist of any kind, but I am a metaphysicist. And so I think of all of this within the terms of metaphysics, with the idea of presenting something that can help us to heal our relationship with ourselves, with the sacred, with the earth, with the other life forms, and with the cosmos, and hope that from this we can set into motion a regenesis of the Western world, and in relationship to the rest of the world also. So, back to light. Any wave or anything, for instance, if I took that ball that you threw to me just before we started, and we were in a total vacuum, right? I could take that and it would roll forever in a straight line. But once it's impeded by electromagnetism in the form of friction, or by passing a very heavy body, it will lose its ability to go straight and will start bending and slowing. So the motion will change to slowing, and it will bend according to the massive body that it passes. So in an unimpeded cosmos, light would travel in a straight line. In an actual cosmos, light is bent by mass. And in its warped journey, time is also lengthened by the bending of light. It requires some explanation. I'm not sure. Time actually changes. Let's see it like this. If we're running a straight line of light, right, and it goes by the sun, it bends because the sun bends space. We used to think that there was this reaction between bodies. It's really not like that. And this was Einstein's huge, even before the ability to test it, this insight. And it was mystical. And he says so in his book, Out of My Later Years. He says there's no conflict between science and spirituality, except for those who don't know any better. He says that straight out. And I'm reading that book again right now as I study a lot of Einsteinians. You know how I go through these phases? Well, right now, it's my Einsteinian phase. So as light in a straight line would take a certain amount of time to get to point B, but because it's warped by space, it goes over here. It has a longer journey. And so time is created in that bending. Can you see that? Time is extended and actually created. Thus, he comes up with a term, the space-time continuum. They're not separate things. Now, we think of time as the Newtonian clock. That is not what time is. Time is the bending of a ray of light and the extending of it because of the warp in space. So, as the intention of universal and eternal consciousness is expressed through the quantum field, it becomes draped in matter. It kind of picks up matter the way a magnetic field would pick up filings. If you threw a handful of filings, if you had a tin sheet and a magnet underneath, and you took the filings and you threw them on the tin sheet, it would show you the magnetic field, which was invisible prior to the filings. Well, in my mind, in my poetic physics, I see it that way, that the intention of consciousness moves through the very first of creation, the quantum field, and then becomes Cosmo Logos, Geologos, Biologos, and Anthropologos. So in that process, this is important. In that process, intention becomes incarnate. The intention of the mind of God becomes incarnate by passing through the quantum field. It picks up the matter and energy of the field and becomes something. It goes from implicate to explicate in that movement. I often languish about the fact that this kind of language isn't used by the churches, the Christian churches, to talk about Eucharist. Because in the Eucharist, the intention of the presider becomes manifest as the mind of Christ in matter. That becomes a hunk of Hamburg and a glass of, it's not that. It becomes universal and infinite light to eat, to simply eat, and have it enter in to universal and eternal light, which we are already. And so all it does is lights it up with the level of consciousness that Christ realized in order to produce it. And so, of course, it's a form of meditation. Liturgy is a form of meditation. And all the rest of the garbage that sends people away from the church, the incessant meetings to figure out how to buy the next parking lot, to build the next, all of that is irrelevant. The only things, there are two things that are true in Christianity. The Eucharist, or communion, right? And confession, the emptying. Those are the only two real realities. The rest of it is kind of like frills on the core. So consciousness incarnate can also be warped by repression and denial, in the same way that light passing a massive object, the movement of consciousness into incarnate form can be warped by the presence of a mass created by repression and denial. So the concentration of repression and denial forms an egoic mass which warps inner space, not outer space, inner space. The presence of the cosmos in us becomes warped by the mass of an egoic consciousness. And that distorts space and thus distorts the original intention emerging from the universal field of consciousness. It becomes warped by the shape of an ego that really is created in a number of different ways and must be dispelled of karmically over a number of lifetimes, right? Or by a direct action of God, in whatever way we understand God, or the ability to have a methodology to disassemble it. And we both know what that methodology is, and I'll talk about it in a minute. So the straight path of what I now call, capital O, capital I, original intention, is warped until the area of psychic mass is emptied either by sunyata, or, which is the Eastern term for it, or confession in the Western understanding, which is also the same understanding as psychology. It is the continual emptying, like a long-term relationship with an awakened counselor is really a long-term relationship with a guru. That's really what it is. So that in the end is what any awakened guide for the soul is, any psycheologist. Psyche is soul in Greek. That's what the word is. So a psycheologist is one who guides. And they've been with us from the shamans and medicine men, the shamanesses and medicine women, both have always guided the tribe, always. They're the ones that lead the vision quests. They're the ones that understand what the psychic disease is that precedes the physical ailments of those who come to them. So, if the soul is emptied, the inner cosmos will transmit the original light of consciousness which precedes incarnation. It precedes it. In other words, it's prior to the quantum field. It precedes it. This virgin light emerging from the realm of darkness. And darkness is not darkness in the sense of Darth Vader. It's not that. It's sacred darkness. Eliot talks about it. Oh, dark, 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 we all go into the dark, the vacant interstellar spaces. He talks about it as the darkness of God. Well, the darkness of God emerges into the light of God. That's what happens in the creation of a universe. The realm of darkness fluctuates into the realm of light. So there is no beginning. That's the whole point. Physics will tell us that, and it sounds like a wisecrack when they do it. There's no beginning, and then they'll say, but in the beginning, right? And all Scripture begins in the beginning, right? So what St. John was trying to do by using, in the beginning of the Gospel of John, he says, in the beginning was the Word, and archein ein ho logos. Well, what are the first three words of the Old Testament, or the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible? In the beginning, same three words. So he thought, and in some ways believed, I'm certain, that he was beginning the Bible again. He was starting over with a whole new insight. So he said, in the beginning was the Word. And what the Word is consciousness. So once the soul is emptied, the inner cosmos, the cosmos that is us, it's not in us, it is us. It's us. We are it. So Thomas Berry put it, and I just came across this. I visited him before he died in October of '07, and he said this: before the human, there was no consciousness, there was no cosmos. And what he meant was that he tells us that the original intention for universal evolution could not be named until humans named it. In other words, until it emerged with the ability to think of itself in self-reflexive consciousness. So then the thing called universe emerged. The horses weren't running around talking about universes, or the dinosaurs. It's not named until the human emerges. So in a strange way, that's a validation of what the Hindus say, that it's all kind of illusory until we emerge. And that's really where I disagree a little bit with Hinduism, because as we emerge, it's there, and we emerge from it as it. So, with Sunyata, cosmos, earth, and the whole life community awaken into being in us. Right now, the actual whales and dolphins and turtles and eagles and quadrupeds, four-legged beings, they're all awakened in us because we are their ability to reflect on themselves. We are that, and we have done a really poor job. Because the ego has bent the light, we don't understand what it is we're doing. And again, on the cross, he says, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Innocent by reason of insanity would be the legal equivalent. A distorted human species, a bent culture, cannot allow the original intention to be expressed in self-reflection. It's prevented. It can't happen because the distortion is so great that the timeline too is bent. It slows the universe down to that extent. And so we can't get to what it is we need now. This is where people like Eckhart Tolle come in, and they say, get into the now, get into the now. Because if we're bent into the future through the distortion of the human soul, the presence of the cosmos within us, we'll never get there because we're always living elsewhere, always elsewhere. So, I'm going to repeat that principle. A distorted human species, a bent or warped culture cannot, not will not, cannot allow the original intention to be expressed in self-reflection. So we are so stuck, even that what we know we need to do, we can't do. You stated it earlier, sitting at the table. You said, I know all this is going on, but what can I do about it? Well, your prayer got answered quickly because this is what we're doing. This is exactly what we're doing. Right here, right now, in the presence and as the presence of the universal field of consciousness. So addiction provides the best example of all of this. Thus, the first step in the 12-step program, which is my first book, Cultural Addiction, it says, we are powerless over an addicted culture that our lives and all of life have been degraded. That's really, again, what you said at the table, that you know it, and knowing it doesn't seem to empower us. Why? Because we're in the actual distortion of the culture in which we're realizing it. And that's why we're powerless. It's not your fault. It's not my fault. We can recycle our cans and all that, and that's polite. You don't throw garbage on the Garden of Eden. You just don't do that. But will that answer it? No, it won't. It has to be a realization, a revelation of universal consciousness. And that is what the program Regenesis and the model Unitive Psychology, the 12 Foundations, is pointing toward, is the way to do that. Addiction theorists know, for instance, that progression is a dynamic of all addiction illnesses. But knowing it, no one's ever really come up with why. Why is it progressive? Why does it always get worse and worse and worse? And in the Einsteinian psychological model, if you want to call it that, the bending of the soul is the reason. And here's why. The larger the gathering of mass around the ego grows, the greater will be the distortion of the soul and of the soul's original intention. So the more massive it gets, the greater the warping, and the less we're able to do anything about it because we've prevented. So the one answer in all traditions, it's always been there, but for some reason, religions aren't speaking to us. Everybody's looking at them, but they're not speaking to us loud enough. We need a unitive understanding, and that's what this is. As the warping increases, the soul is literally, we use this a lot, don't we? The soul is literally bent out of shape. You know, he was really bent out of shape in traffic when he got out of his, right? The soul is literally, we use these terms, we don't really think about them. The soul is bent out of shape. It's literally warped. It cannot be an appropriate transmission of the original light. It's not that it won't be, it's that it can't be. Powerless. Before the word straight was used to describe those who were homosexual versus heterosexual, or the word straight would have been heterosexual versus homosexual, gay or straight, right? In hip language from the 60s, it was those who did not use drugs. Those that did not use drugs were the straights, and we were hip. I'm hip, man, right? Well, that says it all. Why were they straight? Well, first of all, by being straight, they didn't need to use drugs to cool out the pain of the soul, that deep down ache, that itch that we can't scratch, that thing that we know is there but can't really get to. That's the twisting of the soul. The English have a term, his knickers were in a twist, his undies were in a twist. It's like that. His soul doesn't fit right in the body. It doesn't fit right. And because it's warped. It's been warped by the gravity of the ego, by the weight, the mass of the I am, of the ego. Drugs and alcohol are used to medicate the pain of a warped soul. And that condition is only relieved in a real way by the confessional or emptying steps of the 12-step fellowships. And that's why the fellowships really are the next form for spirituality emerging in the West, because they don't offend the precepts of any of the preceding traditions, but they show a very simple way forward in the emptying, which is why I get so intense about the fourth and fifth step, because everything depends on it. Everything. When I say everything, I don't mean everything in one's life. I mean everything depends. And it only requires 5 to 10% of a culture to completely flip a culture. The culture will flip bent toward the good. But there has to be that 5 to 10%. And right now, well, look who we've elected. We elected. Karma is also involved. To be born into a warped family soul, because the soul, a family has a soul, collectively. To be born into a warped family soul is to be predisposed to warping. And to the prescription from hell, the drug of choice, learned by observation in the family of origin, and further in the families we create in adolescence, the group of friends in adolescence. So it starts with the warping of the family that don't see truth as self-evident, and then we perpetuate it and learn our prescription from hell from peers. We call that peer pressure. The word black hole at times is used to describe those with massive repression. Right in the term, isn't it? Massive, with massive repression, with mass of repression, a big quantity of an ego self. If the inner cosmos and the outer cosmos, and I would say here, following Hegel and the idea of Atman and Brahman as one, soul equals universe. We can experience the whole universe in the part of it that we are. That's what mysticism is. That's what that peculiar mind is that emerges. It's the mind of God. We can think with the mind of God if we choose to. It's not just words. We can think, we can feel, we can intuit with the mind of God. And look at what we do. So if they are the same, the inner cosmos and the outer cosmos, which is what I'm holding, same cosmos, right? The cosmos as Ian, the cosmos as Albert. The interiority of each of us is the cosmos. So we're like an hourglass. There's as much inside us as there is outside of us, because we're in that place between, that spot between on an hourglass. And it's the same cosmos in either direction. It's the same cosmos because we are it. So, if the inner and the outer universe are one and the same, then black holes of inner space are not metaphor. You know, this guy's a real black hole, you know. That's used as a metaphor. What it is, more horribly, is the truth. Then black holes of inner space are not metaphors for cosmological black holes. They are local versions of the same phenomenon. Little black holes and larger black holes are both eaters of the light. They eat the light and hold on to it and build an egoic mass. In the U.S. government, the light and intention of the Constitution are warped by the little black holes, by all the little black holes in the Congress, in the Supreme Court, and most obviously in the presidency. If, quote, we the people empty our oppression, if we remove the plank from our eye, we'll see clearly enough to choose correctly in the voting booth. And we shouldn't kid ourselves. You know, we shouldn't kid ourselves. We shouldn't try to say things like, you know, yeah, I was part of the Nazi party in Germany, but I never killed any Jews. If you're part of the Nazi party, you're part of the killing of Jews. If you have voted for people who are clearly either insane or fascist, which is really synonymous, it's really synonymous. Fascism is a form of madness. It really is crazy. That's why it ends that way. So if we the people remove it, we will see clearly enough to make choices correctly in the voting booth. So no matter what you say positive about a Nazi, that makes you a Nazi. That's simple. You become what it is you validate, because V equals V. Values equal the vote. They're a mirror of what we really think and really believe. We're alone in this little environment. And if we understand that V equals V, and therefore V also equals V when they swap, that the vote equals values, values equal the vote, then if we value that which is evil, we become that which we valued because it came from us. That's democracy. That's democracy. Real democracy. Those choices will allow then the evolution of the great republic again to resume and to be the shining city on a hill that Reagan spoke of. Now, I don't know where his spirituality was at, but it had to have some good in it because his son and namesake, Ron Reagan II, in fact, is awake to what's going on, fully awake. He is a really, really good guy. So that's it, really. As the light of the U.S. Constitution is allowed to give its light, the inner cosmos will awaken, and therefore the outer cosmos will do the same because they're the same cosmos. And the U.S. Constitution is, in my opinion, the most sacred and the greatest document ever to come down politically. And we saw the warping in the early writing of the Constitution, where they considered the black folks to be 3/5 of a human for tax purposes. Imagine being black, because it's still in the Constitution. It's just that there's an amendment annulling it. It's still there. If you go look for it, who reads the Constitution, right? There it is. Imagine being black and reading in your Constitution that you were once considered 3/5 of a human to create a deduction for the white man. So we'll go on from here to the very first, I'm just announcing this, I'm not going into it, to the first of the 12 foundations of Unitive Psychology. And there'll be 12 of those for those who are interested. And we'll move on to that. They can also be found in my book, in my daughter's book, The Third Covenant, published by North Atlantic Books. So, as was said at the end of cartoons when I was a kid, that's all, folks.